So, good morning to all of you. Thank you for being here for this panel discussion about South America, from Buenos Aires to Bogotá, an economically restless continent. I'm in charge of economic issues at West France magazine. We are going through an historic moment, says Mr. Aguillon, the professor at the Collège de France, but we are undergoing an historic moment because we are faced with common challenges: climate change, demographic transition. So between Europe and South America, there's a common history that is tragic. There are languages that are shared. We'll try to understand those challenges, and we'll be focusing on three issues: the free trade agreements, climate change, and the role of middle classes regarding the political stability in the different regimes. So, Arancha, GONZALEZ, LAYA. So, you are not a member of the Cercle, but you are a member of a Cercle. You are a former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain. Arancha, go ahead. Thanks a lot, Patrice. Thank you for inviting me. Delighted to be here at X. If you consider the current world, there are two forces at play: interdependence, economic interdependence, finance, climate interdependence. But there are lots of geopolitical rivalries as well. And Europe and Latin America are torn apart. China on the one hand, the United States on the other hand. That's an interesting element. In order to better manage the risks of these geopolitical rivalries and the brutalization of the international economy, Europe should build on Latin America, and Latin America should rely more on Europe. We have some problems. We don't have a problem of European integration. In Latin America, there are some issues of political governance at a time when populist movements are gaining ground. But we need to rely on Latin America and vice versa, i.e. Latin America relying more on Europe. For us, Latin America, this is a huge opportunity regarding climate change. Given the ability of this region to absorb CO2, it's a great opportunity for the diversification of the value chain in order to curtail our excessive reliance on China. It's a great opportunity because Latin America has a lot of raw materials: lithium, copper, graphite. So all the elements that we need for energy transition and technological transition. And I think that we can come up with a new modus operandi whereby we can get access to raw materials, and Latin America can get more added value with those raw materials and commodities. If you consider the Latin American continent is key in terms of security in the world. So have a look at what happened with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So let's look at Latin America. I think that the EU and Latin America can cooperate because Latin America will reduce its dependence on China and the US. And the US has turned out to be politically unstable through trade, through investments, through funding. It's important to beef up productivity and to improve the ability of middle classes to benefit from globalization, to create human capital as well, and to reduce the informal sectors. And all together, we can work for an international order, an international system that could be reshaped, able to provide us with more stability at the international level. So that's it. Patrice for me. Thank you, Arancha, Gonzalez, LAYA. So you have the United States and China. And how can we tap the opportunities between Latin America and Europe? Of course, it would be a good idea to get a snapshot of the economic situation of South America. Eduardo CAVALLO, you represent the Inter-American Development Bank. So in 5 minutes' time, what about this continent that is quite diverse from a political viewpoint?
Much. Good morning, everybody. I apologize, I will speak in English, but my French is not good enough to make it through the 5 minutes, so I'll speak in English. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. I will give an overview of what's going on in Latin America and the Caribbean region, more from the economic side, and what do we see as some of the key challenges for the region going forward. The first thing I want to say is that Latin America and the Caribbean has made a significant amount of progress in terms of macroeconomic stability. This is not the Latin America of the 1980s with the debt crisis and the so-called lost decade. This is not the Latin America of the 1990s with the financial crisis and macroeconomic instability associated to those crises. We have made a significant amount of progress. Of course, there are exceptions. It's quite an heterogeneous region, but we have made progress in terms of stabilizing the economies. The problem is growth. The problem is that this is a region that it's not growing, and it's not growing in a context of very high levels of poverty and very high levels of income inequality, which are fueling discontent among the population. So first, let me provide you a little bit of the evidence. What do I mean by the region not growing? If we look not at the last few years, if we look at the last half a century, average GDP growth in Latin America was about 1.8% per year on average. Of course, this is an average over a long period of time. This is less than half the growth rate of, for example, emerging Asia, and it's even less than the growth rate of advanced economies, meaning that Latin America has not been able to catch up with advanced economies over this period of time and has significantly lagged the performance of other emerging regions. So what are some of the key reasons why the growth rate has been and remains so low, so slow for our region? The first element is what we economists call productivity growth. Okay, it sounds like a little bit of an obscure word, but slow productivity growth is about the misallocation of economic resources. Latin America and the Caribbean has not been able to allocate resources effectively in the economy. If you travel through Latin America, you will see a plethora of small businesses, most of them self-employed people that have sort of activities that are low productivity activities, and that's sort of a common landscape in the region. We do not see a large number of big productive firms that are growing. There are policies and there are restrictions on the ability of firms to grow over time, and that leads to a misallocation of resources because a lot of the capital and labor is employed in these low productivity activities. This has to do with a variety of factors, among them high effective tax rates on larger, more productive firms that stunt firm growth, a significant level of labor taxes that push firms to informal hirings, and frictions in credit markets that distort the efficient allocation of capital. A second problem related to misallocation of resources in the region has to do with informality. You know, almost 60% of the labor force in Latin America works in the informal sector. This is, this is a problem, and it's not just a problem for the poor workers. This is a problem that cuts across the income distribution. Yes, over 80% of the workers in the lowest this decile of the income distribution are informal, but over 40% of the workers from the highest income decile are also working in the informal sector in Latin America. And when you look at the data from the labor markets, a problematic feature that we observe in Latin America now is the resurgence of the informal sector or informality as the main driver of new growth, new job growth in Latin America. So there are several factors that explain this. First, high non-wage formal labor cost. Payroll taxes in Latin America on average are about 30% of wages. This discourages employers from hiring workers legally. Second, we have welfare programs that are available only for workers in the informal sector. These are programs that had very good intentions and were very effective in reducing poverty and inequality, but had the negative impact on labor informality, because if program beneficiaries accept...
Eduardo, CAVALLO, peut-être qu'on va revenir en...
Eduardo will be able, to talk about these questions. So can you conclude?
If informal workers accept a formal job, they lose this benefit. And the third element is human capital, the problem with the poor quality of education, and I'll get to that as we go into the questions. So let me stop here, and then we'll continue. Thank you.
Merci.
Thanks a lot, Eduardo. So, Marie-Aude, Marie-Aude, you are the Chief Executive Officer with CNP Assurance. So 60% of the workers are working in the informal sector. So what about the role of middle classes as a factor of political stability, a factor of growth through your business activities? You have 5 minutes. Thanks a lot. So good morning to all of you. So thanks a lot for inviting me. Regarding CNP Assurance, Latin America is a continent that is dear to our hearts. In Brazil, for example, we are the leading French company in terms of net income, and we are the third insurance company in Brazil. So we are working with the Caixa Econômica, the Federal Caixa Econômica, the third largest bank in Brazil, a public bank, and we've diversified our partnerships. We're working with Correios, the Brazilian postal services, and we signed an agreement this week with Banco de Brasilia. So we work with all those banks, and we can address all the layers of the population of the banks, have a very good insight into population patterns. They know very well the economy, and with our 14 million insurers, we can be in sync with the people's requirements and needs. The insurance business has a key role to play, a full-fledged role to play in order to help the middle classes faced with the many challenges the middle classes have to take up. We talked about the informal economy. It's an important point. Access to higher education, that's also a topic, and the environment. So on our side, we wondered how we could help and back the middle class, and what are the challenges, what is at stake. So if you consider Brazil, it's a diversified country. Growth was a reality, and economic growth was a reality at the expense of environmental challenges, and there are lots of inequalities in Brazil. In order to connect the world, to bridge the different types of world, we are convinced that the poorest people should be able to emancipate themselves, to reduce the gaps with the richest people. And we have a social bedrock with CNP Assurance. So what are the challenges that we need to take up? You need to consider the weight of the informal economy. It accounts for 40% of the economy. And at the end of the day, people in informal economy, they can't be protected from a social viewpoint. Inflation levels are high. In Argentina, inflation is quite high. In Brazil, inflation is nudging 10%, having an impact on real income. Third challenge, the lack of education, and it reduces the employability of the population. Beyond those complex dimensions from a macroeconomic viewpoint, how insurance can be a safety net for these populations. When you want to undertake, when you want to create growth, you need to take risks. And what does it mean? It means that you need to be hedged, to be protected. To illustrate what I'm saying, I will give you an example about family structures. They rely on a single source of income. When you have an accident, when you are ill, when you die, basically you can be immersed in precariousness. In Europe and in Latin America, there are some benefits that could be granted, but it's important to develop micro-insurance in order to cope with these two risks: access to quality care, and how we can protect our families should there be a death in your family. We've developed two types of offers with micro-insurance, very affordable from a financial viewpoint. These are products worth €2 a month, and access to those products for those people. Of course, people will be able to buy an insurance product in the traditional networks of banks, and these products can be bought in lottery points or in postal or post centers. Do you want to add something? Of course, there's a lot of energy in this continent, and the idea behind that is to help and back the people, and we can use the insurance products in order to make sure that the middle class can emerge. Thank you for these tangible solutions. Mariana Campos, you are representing Mexico Evalua. There's a new president who worked with the IPCC. Mexico is the first commercial partner, trade partner with the US. Lots of relocation, location processes. You have the floor to talk about that.
Well, I would like to start giving a little bit of context on Mexico. So Mexico opened its economy. We think it has been for a long time, but it's really recent, just at the end of the 80s and the early 90s. Before that, Mexico was a closed economy. And that happened with the NAFTA. The NAFTA was a very important transition to open our economy and to take advantage of globalization. The results of that is that Mexico increased tremendously, the exports of goods and services, and it also attracted international investment, foreign investment, direct investment. So our economy was in another level after NAFTA. However, the benefits of NAFTA were not equal for all regions and provinces in Mexico. And this is key to understand. If we divide and disaggregate all these benefits, what we see is that the states that were building chains of production with the US and related to NAFTA, they grew a lot more than the ones that were not related, that are basically located in the south of Mexico and, of course, have a lot more of informality. So we can say that, of course, we have different Mexicos. The Mexico that is very productive, that you have a formal economy, and the Mexico that is with a lot of informality and it's, of course, unproductive or less productive. So what we realize is that if you take the growth from 1984 to the year 2014, we saw that those states grew like 60%, while the states that were not related to NAFTA grew 2%. So they were basically stagnant, but of course with population growth. So one of the problems of this situation is that we need to improve how these benefits can go to other regions of Mexico and how we can deal with this informality. And there is a lot of policy issues that we need to solve in order to address those things. I would say also that even though NAFTA gave us a motor for our economy to grow, now we need a boost, definitely, because if you take into account Mexico's growth from the year 2000 to the year 2022, we are or in the level of Latin America or even below. So, for example, Peru was growing in that period more than 4% GDP, and Mexico was growing below 2%. So we still need to work on a boost, and we have now the UMCA treaty, and of course this amazing opportunity to grow with the nearshoring. The problem is that we don't have, we are facing limitations in the inputs that production need. First of all, the energy sector, I think, is one of the main issues in Mexico. First is that we have historically an underinvested sector that has been controlled by the government with monopolies on energy, in the electricity side and in the oil side. So what we're facing right now is an increased demand that has no echo in the supply. So, and especially in the past 6 years, private investment has been stopped, and then the public investment can't actually grow. Actually, if we see the numbers, the public budget that invests in electricity was cut in generation of energy, in transmission of energy and distribution. But at the same time, as I was saying, the private investment is not flowing, and this is a political issue. We actually designed the institutional infrastructure to make it possible since 2014, but in 2018, with the current administration, these institutional infrastructure for letting the private investment flow into this sector was stopped. So now, of course, we are facing with this new president. What is she going to do? Is she going to continue to stop the private investment? Is she going to continue to stop the energy transition? Because also that was one of the problems we are facing with this new administration, the current administration. So we need to, of course, foster the supply for energy, and we have to offer lower prices in energy. We have to do the energy transition. Mexico has great capacity in the solar and wind energy supply. So those are the tracks that we need to go. We also face a problem with water, and this is also part of the underinvestment that we have been facing in water. And to tell you a number that it's really scary, 70% of our territory right now in March was experiencing severe drought, okay? And we also have problems with human capital. 54% of the demand for employment is not really satisfied because they don't find the personnel with the skills they need. So we need to improve policies in education in order to have a better coordination between the supply and the demand for employment. So there's human capital challenges, water challenges, and of course energy challenges. And I would end with this thing. One of the problems we are structurally facing since ever, one of my friends and colleagues says that we've been 200 years suffering this problem, is the fiscal policy. Mexico is very different from Latin America in the fiscal standpoint. Latin America collects around 23% of GDP, the national government. Mexico collects, including Social Security, 26%. 16%. So we are like 7 GDP points under. And this is because this kind of revenue that was not collected with taxes was compensated from oil revenues from the state company. But those revenues have been decreasing since 12 years ago, dramatically. I'm going to tell you that this year, 2024, was the first year that we have seen no money from the oil revenue coming to the public budget. So, and the governments don't want to face a fiscal reform. So some of our problems have to be with a low financial capacity to finance the public services. And of course, one question is, why do energy has to be a public service? It doesn't have to be. So we need to let private investment in a very wise form, because it's a huge political topic in Mexico, to come in the sectors.
Mariana,
I'll stop there.
Mariana Campos, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mariana. And thank you for shedding light on the human capital, environmental capital. And of course, there's a staggering figure. So 70% of the Mexican territory faced with severe droughts. So we need to talk about South America. We'll be talking about Brazil, 250 million inhabitants. Jorge, VIANA, you represent Apex Brazil. So can you take stock of the situation in Brazil? Brazil has changed quite a lot from Jair Bolsonaro to Lula. Lula is back. So what about Brazil? What is the situation like in Brazil?
Thank you very much. We're not hearing the microphone. We need to sort out the speaker's microphone. The Portuguese interpreter is not hearing the Brazilian speaker, unfortunately. Could we just give him a different microphone, perhaps? Because the microphones elsewhere on the stage were working. No, the problem is that we're not hearing it in the interpreting booth. So if he can switch microphones, that would be good. Our Portuguese interpreter is not hearing it. Okay, now we're getting it. That's all right. Okay, it's all good. I'm the chair of Apex Brazil, the Brazilian agency that promotes business and products from Brazil in France. It's a bit like Business of France. So my contribution here today will be to talk a bit about Brazil, but first of all to talk about the world. I think that global problems are more complex than we realize. So we are faced with a number of worldwide issues, and we're struggling to find solutions to some of the most basic problems: inequality, famine, water shortages. When I was a senator, I was part of a World Water Forum here in Marseille, and at the time 1 billion people didn't have access to water. There's famine around the world. There are conflicts that are recurring, and alongside this, we are faced with a demographic crisis with aging populations. And this is one of the most serious crises that we're facing, because it will make a real impact on the lives of families and on public budgets as well. There's an energy crisis. There's also a climate crisis, because all of these aspects represent a threat to life. I'm a forest engineer. I live in the Amazonian region. I'm a mayor of my town. I've also been a senator. And when I worked with Chico Mendes 30 years ago, we were already talking about issues in the world's tropical areas and the global production and consummation system, which was completely unsustainable. Even though this model has improved the lives of people in Europe and the United States, it is nonetheless a model which has not helped the majority of people living on our planet. It's become a big problem, because a major part of the climate crisis comes from these northern countries. We could also mention China and some other Asia countries. In South America, we're not responsible for the emissions, but we are hit by massive spending in order to pay for adaptation to climate change. Climate change is affecting South America, in particular Brazil. In tropical countries, extreme climate-related phenomena are going to become even more serious, and we're going to have to face up to this issue. I'm delighted to hear the level of debate here, and I would love to come back here again to take part again in the future and be part of a panel, because Brazil in the past had a terrible image in Europe and around the world. We had a government similar to what's happening in other parts of the world. In Europe, people are tired and have started telling themselves new stories on social media, and this is creating space for populist politicians who are coming to power. Our former president in Brazil was the worst member of parliament in 30 years. He was the worst MP, and he nonetheless managed to get a hold of presidential power. He doubled the rate of deforestation, and a large proportion of the population turned back to extreme poverty. But thanks to the vote of the Brazilian population, President Lula came back for a third term. This is something unprecedented in Brazil. No one previously had been elected president for 3 separate terms. He came back with strength and energy, and he wants to make Brazil a great example again. Brazil is a major food producer, slightly behind the European Union as a whole, but we're a major producer and major exporter of food products. We have high levels of biodiversity. 20% of the world's biodiversity is in Brazil. 12% of species, 20% of mineral ores, and we are a major reference in terms of sustainable energy. 85% of our energy mix is sustainable in Brazil. We will, in the future, hope to become a leader in green hydrogen and to export green hydrogen. Next year is the year of Franco-Brazilian relationships. And I'll come back to talk about the opportunities to invest in Brazil, because President Lula has created the world's largest social program with 400 million euros to attract investment in logistics, in food production, and there's going to be a new phase of industrialization in our country. There are a lot of opportunities, and I'm delighted to see that Brazil is now going to be a key actor again on the world stage. It's no longer going to be a problem, but will be part of the solution. I think it's very important, therefore, that France gets on board and stands alongside Brazil, because I think Brazil can play a significant role in combating the climate crisis. I don't know if I could just add one more thing. I would like to say that we are the largest economy in Latin America. The Mercosur organization has been founded, and we have been working for 20 years to try and sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. I know that France is rather opposed to this FTA, but we're close to a window of opportunity. We might be able to conclude this agreement without creating problems for the European Union, and that will be the biggest free trade agreement in the world, because the two regions represent 700 million people, and we will bring a very rich region, rich in raw materials, with a big consuming region, the EU. So President Euro will seek to make his most utmost efforts to ensure that this free trade agreement comes into force, and it will change the history of Latin America and Europe. Thank you very much for advocating so strongly in favor of free trade agreements. As you said, this free trade agreement with Mercosur countries is very controversial here in France. I'm going to turn back to Mariana Campos. You talked about the positive results of the NAFTA agreement. What could help us to get beyond the contradictory agreements about the Mercosur free trade agreement? What is the experience of NAFTA that could help us to understand it, to get to ratification, because the agreement has actually been signed?
Yes, I would first say that the problems are in Mexico more political than economical. It's not that we don't have economic issues, but we have the solutions for those issues. Eduardo was just saying before about how the benefits in Latin America have been very unequal. And that has fostered a lot of discontent. We cannot go forward without taking that into account, because that discontent has nurtured political movements that are favoring autocracy, that are debilitating our democracies. And so what we have to put in the center in Mexico is the social security. Social security is key. If we had before a good design, a universal inclusion of social security, I think our history would be very different, and the results of NAFTA would have been very different. In Mexico, for example, a doctor or an architect or a lawyer, that they have their own businesses. They are not forced, and nobody, since it doesn't have, those professionals do not have an employer, there's no one paying and supporting their social security registration. So that automatically produces informality and people that are going to grow old with no pension. So we have to fix that. Social security can't not go forward depending on the labor status. People need to contribute, and the governments need to contribute to people's pensions. The worst model, we can discuss pensions in another panel, but the worst model is nobody seeing that, nobody paying for that. Because what is happening is that people are reaching an old age, and now the government is providing those pensions from current expenses. And that is taking money from education and from health. We have not only the inequality among the different levels of income, we have inequality in the generations. We have been financing those pensions without a tax reform and taking out money from kids' projects and from kids, the investment in children and in youth. This is not good for the future. So Mexico has to address a tax reform and get rid of the unproductive public expenses. Some of them, for example, are subsidies to fueled energies that are actually regressive. So we have to take rid of that, and we have to build a good social security system. We have to do a very progressive tax reform, and of course, taking into consideration all that we can achieve with private investment. We have to prioritize private investment through private and public partnerships. But that is a political issue that we have to overcome.
Merci Mariana Campos.
Thank you very much, Mariana Campos. I'm going to turn back to Eduardo Cavallo now. If we refer to Brazil, the world's farm, the world's meat producer, there's a lot of concern amongst French farmers. What could we say about the Mercosur Free Trade Agreement? How do you see this question? How could we find a solution and get beyond the current contradictions and controversies around the agreement?
Thank you very much for that question. Mercosur was a very useful tool to integrate the economies of the Southern Cone. Now it's facing a challenge. It's originally designed as a customs union, meaning that countries are supposed to have a common external tariff. But the problem is there are so many exemptions to that common external tariff that in reality Mercosur is working as a hybrid between a free trade area and a customs union, so it's not reaping the benefits, the full benefits of either. And one of the problems is that it's hard for the bloc as a bloc to negotiate free trade agreements outside the Mercosur area. So the Mercosur is debating itself how to navigate that situation and how to adjust to the new global realities. Let me take the opportunity to also address issues related to trade, but also other aspects that have to do with the outlook of Latin America, because my previous intervention, I discussed the problems, but there are also opportunities. The president of the IDB, Langolfan, a fellow Brazilian here, he talks about Latin America being at an inflection point. And what he means by that is that Latin America is well positioned in the global economy to help the global economy address some of its most pressing challenges. Let's take the issue of climate change, which has come up here in this discussion. Latin America is home to the Amazon, which absorbs 25% of the carbon dioxide and is home to the largest biodiversity in the global economy. So Latin America can play a role in the global fight against climate change. Or the energy transition, for example. Latin America has the minerals, lithium, graphite, and others that are necessary for the global transition to happen. So we need to develop that in a context in which the region improves free trade and allows this potential to manifest itself. Thank you.
Sur cette question
With regard to this question of the Amazon region, the planet's lungs, if you like, how can we ensure that a long-term climate policy remains sustainable and aren't challenged every time there's a new election?
Dos 200 milhões de brasileiros que
That's a very good question. We have 200 million people who live in the Amazonian region. It's perhaps one of the richest regions on the planet in terms of resources, but there's a lot of poverty in the region as well. So the political decision that was taken at the presidential elections in Brazil is a fundamental choice that will enable us to face up to this risk. the previous government was negationist. During the COVID pandemic, nearly 1 million Brazilian people died of COVID. It's a government that destroyed public policy. It had a scornful attitude towards indigenous people and increased the destruction of the Amazon. This drew the world's attention. Since the new recent presidential elections, Lula has come back with a social policy program, and the aim is to reduce illegal deforestation to zero in the Amazon region. We are seeking to integrate this region into Brazil's economy. Inflation is lower in Brazil than in Europe, and we're going to achieve roughly 3% growth. We have mineral wealth with various mineral ores such as lithium. In order to fuel the energy transition, we also have biofuels, and this could be something that would be useful for Europe and the rest of the world. Brazil is also a key stakeholder because we are currently chairing the G20, and we're going to host the COP30 conference in the Amazonian region next year. This all creates an environment based on the population's electoral choice, and this will help the world face up to the complex challenges that we are confronted with. There are challenges around digital connectivity and artificial intelligence. These issues also need to be taken into account. I want it to be very clear. The President Lula's government wants to create a broad middle class in Brazil. The subsequent government ended up creating extreme poverty. We need strong middle classes. We need to have public policies that will manage the demographic crisis. In Europe, you might end up losing about half of your population over the next few decades. In Africa, there's major demographic growth. There'll be 9 to 10 billion people on our planet in years to come. And a large proportion of this population will be in Africa. A large proportion of this population will be Muslim. We need to be tolerant. There is such diversity in our world. Arriving here, I have been delighted to see someone who was a hostess at this event, a black lady with a Muslim hijab, and we live in a diverse world, and the world needs to look to Europe and its model of diversity as a model. And I think the demographic crisis is an important. Thank you for your warm words about diversity. Before I hand back to you, Marie-Aude, THÉPAUT, on this issue about the middle classes and preserving its emergence, do you think that the situation is fairly positive in Brazil? Yes, I think everything we've seen over the last few years shows that the middle classes are emerging, but we need to be very careful about emerging inequalities, because Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world. So we need to be very aware of this point. I'd just like to go back to some of the environmental questions that have been raised. We've talked about drought in Mexico. There's also been a very dramatic flooding in the Rio Grande do Sul region this year. And I think it's really important that we all act with responsibility and to combat deforestation. All world stakeholders have a role to play, and alongside the Amazon Institute for Conservation, we're trying to ensure that the indigenous communities don't leave, because this is a thing that accelerates deforestation, and indigenous peoples are key in combating climate change. Thank you, Marie-Aude, THÉPAUT. It's great to see insurers who are getting committed to this struggle. There are about 5 minutes left for questions from the floor now. You're going to get a microphone coming to you, sir. So a short question, and let's have some short, brief answers to ensure a good debate.
La Cruz. I'm a journalist born in Guatemala, but I have been investigating misery and child labor in supply chains for more than 10 years. One very important issue that I would ask you to address, and maybe Jorge can speak about this, is the fact that today, every cup of coffee we have here contributes to misery and child labor in Latin America. Europe is the largest importer of coffee in the world, and Brazil cannot even export roasted coffee to Germany because there is a coffee tax of €2.19 per kilo. But worse than that, the whole trade system that Europe calls fair is extremely unfair for Latin America, and there's child labor in Chiapas in Mexico and even in other agricultural products. But I would like Mr. Jorge to comment on this. Thank you.
Yes, it is indeed a problem, a very important problem in Latin America. In Brazil, we don't have child labor anymore. When extreme poverty came back in our country, we actually saw child labor starting up again. So for every cup of coffee, every 4 cups of coffee that are drunk around the world, 1 cup comes from 1 cup comes from Brazil, $250,000 million, and a lot of the value chain goes to value goes to countries that don't grow the coffee. The situation is even worse with regard to cocoa. The biggest producer countries for cocoa are Ivory Coast and Ghana. We all love eating chocolate, and the producers in these countries earn very little of the money. Out of $100, the producers who grow the cocoa only get $1. All of the other people who earn money are the people who process the chocolate in North America, in Asia, and in Europe. We need to think about these issues to ensure that the world gets its produce from Latin America with ESG principles, proper governance and environmental principles. That's what we're trying to do in Brazil. Thank you very much. Any other questions? We've got perhaps 2 minutes left. Thank you very much. With high levels of economic growth, there's often, unfortunately, corruption. And I'd like to hear what solutions, what suggestions can be made in order to combat the plague of corruption, which is a real obstacle for economic growth in Latin America. Mariana CAMPOS.
Front that we have to tackle, and we haven't been able to. Crime in Mexico is growing tremendously, and that has to be taken into consideration because crime actually taxes companies, businesses in Mexico, and this is an economic load, but of course a lot more than that. It's like a cancer to our economy. So right now we are not. We have a terrible, in my opinion, a terrible constitutional reform in Mexico. Our current regime is putting in the Congress a reform in order to elect judges through direct vote, all judges in Mexico, and that will disappear the professional career of judges. So that is just not the thing that we need right now, because judges should be, punishing crime and corruption. They don't have to be, their designation shouldn't be politicized, because that would increase corruption. So what I'm trying to tell you with this is that I think we're going the other way. Instead of strengthening our institutions and the governance of the institutions and the plans for tackling corruption and crime, we are going the other way. We are going the other way, and I think it's an important risk to follow. I don't know if In more countries of Latin America, maybe yes, but in Mexico, definitely.
Bah, écoutez, je crois que ça...
Thank you. I'm afraid that's probably going to be the point where we have to wrap up. Thank you very much for listening to us. We've heard about the importance of the rule of law. We've heard about climate change, and without the rule of law, we can't do anything. So thank you very much to Arancha González LAYA. Thank you, Eduardo CAVALLO. Thank you, Marie-Aude. THÉPAUT. Thank you, Mariana Campos and Jorge. VIANA. Thank you for taking part in this round table. There would have been so much to say.